Good morning. Y'all sleep. Good morning. My name is Andrea Ritchie. As Courtney pointed out, my work over the past 20 years has focused on police violence against Black women and LGBTQ people and women and LGBTQ people of color. I'm also a Black lesbian immigrant, and I say that because all three of those things very much inform how I approach this work. I also want to start by thanking Hakeem Jeffries and Stephen Moore for all of their hard work in putting together this truly extraordinary event and for inviting me to be a part of it. As we honor and build on Dr. King's legacy, we're reminded that police brutality and state violence have been and continue to be a constant feature of the other America, and that mass criminalization of Black people in the United States has impeded progress on every front of struggles for Black liberation since the abolition of chattel slavery. But I don't count on me to say that. Let's hear it straight from Dr. King.
There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality.
So that's a part of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech that doesn't get recycled every year on King Day, but one that we need to attend to. And as indicated, my work examines issues of racial profiling and police violence and criminalization through the lens of the experiences of Black women, which is not the lens through which we generally talk about or understand these issues, but one that is instructive and essential to Black liberation. And I can assure you that it is in fact not the case that police officers are not interested in women. In fact, they are very much interested in women in many different ways that are similar to Black men and in many ways that are unique and gender specific. So the nation recently relearned the story of Racy Taylor thanks to Oprah's speech during the Golden Globes, and I urge all of you to learn the story behind Racy's, which is told by Michigan scholar Danielle McGuire's book At the Dark End of the Street, which is that the movement for behind Dr. King was one that was led by Black women, and led by Black women who were both targets of and leaders of the resistance against sexual violence and rape of Black women like Racy Taylor, and of women like Gertrude Perkins, who was brutally raped by 2 Montgomery, Alabama police officers as she walked home one evening 10 years before the Montgomery bus boycott began. Women like Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old who was physically and sexually assaulted and arrested by officers who were removing her from a segregated bus in Montgomery 9 months before Rosa Parks was, and 9 months before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. But Claudette Colvin did not become the face of the civil rights movement because she was dark-skinned, because she was poor, and because she was pregnant at the time that she was physically and sexually assaulted by police officers. And that we center the experiences of women like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a well-recognized leader of the civil rights movement, but what is not as well known about her is that she experienced physical and sexual violence at the hands of police after desegregating a lunch counter in Kansas. So in fact, Black women's experiences of sexual violence at the hands of police are not relics of distant past of the Jim Crow era, but in fact have persisted throughout the history of policing in the United States from slave patrols to the present. It happened during Union Army liberation of cities during the Civil War, and was certainly also a central feature of lynching. And it certainly persists to the present day as evidenced by the conviction of former Oklahoma City police officer Daniel Holtzclaw, whose sexual assault of 13 Black women came to light in 2015. And what I'll tell you about that, without going into too much detail, is that his actions are not an anomaly. They're simply a manifestation of an ongoing pattern of state violence against Black women. Sexual misconduct and rape by law enforcement agents is the second most frequently reported form of police misconduct after excessive force. But it's certainly not the second most frequently talked about, even though we're currently in the midst of a national conversation about sexual violence. A shroud of silence continues to surround instances and patterns of sexual violence by police officers. So Daniel Holtzclaw was only unique in that he was caught, convicted, and sentenced to 263 years in prison. But his patterns of targeting Black women during traffic stops, during drug law enforcement, in the context of broken windows or order maintenance policing, welfare checks, and his patterns of preying on teens and women who were profiled as using drugs, and women in the sex trades are consistent with documented patterns of police sexual violence nationwide. According to one study conducted looking at data over a 10-year period, an officer is caught in an act of sexual misconduct every 5 days. And in 70% of those cases, they're targeting motorists, crime victims, domestic violence victims, sexual violence victims, teenagers in schools and youth engagement programs. And law enforcement officials, it's not just me saying this, law enforcement officials, researchers, and advocates agree that the officers who are caught represent just the tip of the iceberg. So sexual violence by police against black women is not just a problem of a few rogue officers who can be caught and made an example of, as Daniel Holtzclaw was, but they're part of the regular repertoire of policing and police violence in the United States. And sexual harassment, extortion, and violence against black women are in fact really central features of both traffic stops and the war on drugs, which we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes, including the form of violent and degrading and sometimes public strip and cavity searches of black women who are routinely profiled as drug users, couriers, and concealers. So this is just one example, the case of Sharnezia Corley, who was a 20-year-old college student who was out one night on her way to pick up medicine for her grandmother at the store, when she was pulled over by an officer for failing to stop at a stop sign, allegedly. The officer stuck his head in the car, claimed to smell marijuana, and after making her wait an hour for a female officer to arrive, the female officer, you cannot see it very well in the image there, but this is the dash cam video which proves this happened, forced her down to the ground, pulled her pants down, spread her legs, and forcefully digitally penetrated her vagina and searched it for 11 minutes. So I can tell you that, to paraphrase Dr. Baumgarten, searching your vagina is also a really bad thing that can happen during a traffic stop. And she experienced that as sexual violence, obviously, and this is how the war on drugs is waged on the bodies of black women. So in other instances across the country, officers extort sex from black women under the threat of mandatory minimum sentences that are being aggressively pursued once again by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. These kinds of searches, I mean, the data that you saw earlier talked about sort of vehicle searches. These kinds of searches take place with alarming frequency for black women, and they particularly, in one study the federal government conducted at airports, found that black women were subjected to these kinds of searches 9 times more frequently than anyone else. So it really, again, when you're, through my presentation, I'm looking at these issues through the lens of women's experiences, which is kind of a remix. And if you look through the lens of those experiences, you start to see more of the same thing in the same places, but happening to black women. But then you also start to see different things if you look at the data differently. But the war on drugs, these very same mandatory minimum drug sentences that we're talking about, have driven the growth of the prisons population, the women's prison population, by over 700% over the last 4 decades, making women the fastest growing prison population in the United States. And the growth in the women's population in prison is outpacing the growth of the men's population by 50% over that same time frame. So my book and my work has been about looking at the patterns of policing that produce these numbers. And what we see is that thanks to racial profiling and discriminatory enforcement, black women continue to be incarcerated at twice the rate of white women. And while we know that 1 in 3 black men will face incarceration in their lifetimes, many of us don't know that 1 in 2 black trans women will face incarceration in their lifetime, making black trans women actually the most incarcerated population in the United States. So this shifts, hopefully, our understanding, or expands our understanding of how we need to tackle these issues. For Shelley Hilliard, who was a black trans woman from Detroit, the war on drugs proved deadly. She was arrested for prostitution, and then they found a small amount of marijuana in the hotel room that she was working in, and the police told her she could either wear a wire and make a buy from her dealer or go to jail, which for trans women is tantamount to sexual and physical violence, and also face the possibility of a drug or prostitution conviction, which many of us know, like we said, mandatory minimum sentences can lead to a number of things, but either of those convictions can also lead to losing your access to housing, employment, and jobs, and your children if you have some. So shoved between this rock and a hard place, Shelley agreed to do it. And then she was murdered and brutally dismembered and left all over Detroit when police failed to protect her identity as an informant. This is how the war on drugs is waged on black women. So what do we learn by expanding our analysis of state violence and criminalization of black people along the axes of gender, gender identity, and sexuality. As I said, we learned to look more carefully where we're already looking for Black women's stories, and whether the issue is the war on drugs or the war or traffic stops or anything else, and to look even more deeply. So for instance, if we look at nationwide, when traffic stop data is disaggregated by both race and gender, we see that the rates of racial disparities in traffic stops are identical among men and women. And in fact, in some jurisdictions, they're higher. So in Ferguson, the year before Mike Brown was killed, the group of people who experienced the greatest number of traffic stops of any other group was Black women. The same is true for street encounters and stop and frisk. So these are the numbers, the stop and frisk numbers in New York City. You'll see that even though women experience a lower number of stops, the rates of racial disparity among stops of women are identical to those among stops of men. And then what we also found is that during those stops, women were experiencing unique forms of racialized gender humiliation and degradation. So for instance, women described having their purses emptied out on the sidewalk by police officers, and out come their birth control pills, their condoms, their diaphragms, their maybe extra set of underwear they were carrying coming to and from work. And that became a moment where police officers began to comment on their bodies, their sexualities, what they were doing with those condoms. Were those evidence that they might be engaged in prostitution? They would hold up their belongings and show them to the community. And then, because, as is often the case, they found nothing and there was no reason to stop them in the first place, then walk away. But then how vulnerable does that leave women to the community they're left in? It's clear the police are not only not going to protect them, they're going to violate them, and now they've been exposed and sexually and gender humiliated in front of everyone in their community. So that means the extent that we're pursuing remedies against racial profiling, for instance, of the kind of legislation that North Carolina and other jurisdictions are pursuing, or the federal End Racial and Religious Profiling Act, that we need to make sure that we're looking and arguing for and advocating for bans against profiling, not only based on race, but also based on gender and gender identity, because both are operating in the context of stops such as these. It means the extent that we're looking at state violence and criminalization through the lens of the school-to-prison pipeline, we need to be addressing the experiences of Black girls who experience some of the highest rates of racial disparity in school discipline and in school push-out, which, if you read Monique Morris's book, Push Out, you'll see that it's about young girls as young as 5, being subjected to, one, an understanding of their appearance and behavior that reflects what Georgetown University researchers called adultification, and what Monique Morris calls age compression, which is basically we don't see Black girls as girls or children, we see them as mini Black women, and then we treat them in the same way, as inherently sexual, as inherently promiscuous, as inherently devious, as inherently tolerant of pain, as inherently unfeeling and not in need of support or protection, which means that a Black girl standing up for herself gets perceived as disorderly in school, gets perceived as threatening or disturbing a school. A girl who pulls her cell phone out in a classroom because she just lost her mom and is trying to figure out what's happening and doesn't put it away fast enough for the teacher is dragged out by an armed police officer who throws her out of her chair. That's what these arrests look like in school, and the consequences for Black girls are devastating. It means that we look at gender-specific sites of racial profiling, like the enforcement of prostitution-related offenses. If you look at how prostitution laws are enforced, you will see some of the highest rates of racial disparity in any sector of the criminal legal system. In New York City, 85% of people arrested for prostitution-related offenses are Black or Latina women. I can assure you that's not the proportion of folks involved in the sex trade. But that's how the police are enforcing it, and they're doing it based on age-old stereotypes rooted in slavery and colonialism. That needs to demand our attention. The ways in which Black mothers are perceived and criminalized through the child welfare system in what has been dubbed the new Jane Crow needs to be as much a subject of our attention as traffic stops, driving while Black, and enforcement of drug laws. And finally, another thing that we learned from examining state violence and criminalization through the experiences of Black women is that racial profiling and police violence are also pervasive in the context of responses to calls for assistance. As was the case for Aura Rain Rosser, an artist, a mother of 3, and a survivor of domestic violence and child abuse, who was killed by Ann Arbor police responding to a domestic violence call on November 9, 2014, just a few months after Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson. Thanks to the work of Ann Arbor for Black Lives, we have an analysis of how the racially gendered perceptions of Black women that are driving state violence and mass incarceration of Black people played out in the killing of Aura Rosser. And these same dynamics contribute to police killings and criminalization of Black women survivors of family and community violence, of homophobic and transphobic violence, like Kiwi Haring, who was killed by St. Louis police who were responding to a call for help after sort of a 6 months of a campaign of homophobic and transphobic terror by her downstairs neighbor, who had literally set fire to her front porch the night before the call that killed her. And when police responded to that call, the one they killed was Kiwi Haring. And of Black women in mental health crises across the country, including, for instance, Charlene Lyles, who was killed by Seattle police reporting a burglary. That's what we think police officers are supposed to do. They're supposed to answer calls for help during burglaries. And in her case, instead of helping her within minutes of entering her home, they interpreted her actions to be threatening, told a story about a knife, which, to my knowledge, there's no evidence or proof of whatsoever, and shot her dead in front of her children in her apartment. So if a woman can be shot by police on a domestic violence call, and a call for a hate crime, or a call for a burglary, then I think we really, under all the circumstances in which we ostensibly rely on police for protection, then I think that Black women's experiences of state violence and criminalization teach us that remedying state violence can't focus solely on laws that require us to address racial profiling, or on minor reforms to stop and frisk practices, or decriminalization of marijuana or drugs as a whole. All these things would be very important to reducing the harms I've been talking about here, but they're not sufficient. So Black women's experiences of sexual violence by police, of denial of protection, of criminalization, and of violence, physical and sexual, in the context of our presence in public spaces, in the context of our parenting, in the context of our survival in the face of the violence in our communities and our homes, teach us that what is really required is a radical re-examination of the role of police and a radical re-envisioning of our concept of safety and the means that we devote to achieving it. It requires us to tackle the conditions and perceptions of Black women that make us vulnerable to both state and interpersonal and community violence and criminalization, many of which were the subject of Dr. King's Other America speech. Ultimately, it means that we all need to commit to realizing Dr. King's dream of a world free from police brutality, which is the only way we'll achieve Black liberation, through agendas for resistance that make these statements a reality. Thank you.